Thank you for being here at this session of the Sports Writers Festival. My name's Francis Leach. I'm one of the founders and the curator of the Sports Writers Festival, along with Michael Edgley, my colleague out there, and Andy Kelly, who's in Sydney at the moment. We thank you for being here, and we're glad you can make it on what's turned out to be a fairly awful Melbourne afternoon. So there might be a few coming in late because of the weather. So this particular session is an important one because many of us have been involved in the media, have been where you are right now. And I know I have. I was an RMIT media student. But when I started, there wasn't any course for sports writing. We had to try to find our own way into the sports media however we could. But I know the Trobe University, who are our great partners, along with Skins, Jamie Fuller and the Skins Company, the friends at raw.com.au, and also our partners with cyclingtips.com. But La Trobe in particular have focused very heavily on making sports writing a feature, making sports culture something that's worth studying and understanding and becoming expert in dealing with, because it's such a huge part in the wider culture. And that's a bit about what today's about. But it's also about the art of writing, because our guest is somebody who has worked very hard at becoming a very fine writer. It hasn't just happened. And I think today we'll hear a little bit about how Bryan Curtis got to the position he's in today as one of the esteemed sports writers at The Ringer, previously at Grantland and ESPN, and his own unique way of finding his voice. And I think that's the crucial thing in all of this, is finding your own voice through your writing so that you become alive on the page, which is what makes any great writing worth reading. Just a quick note from me as a way of saying thank you to you. We do have Tim Cale in here after this session at 8 o'clock. If you fancy hanging around and staying here for that conversation that I'll be hosting with him, because it's been such a tough afternoon to get here. I know you're all in the middle of your final assignments and whatnot. If you want to stay and hear that conversation, courtesy of us, for free, all you need to do is on your way, go and see Michael, and he'll get your names and make sure you're on the list, and you can come back in after this session and enjoy what's bound to be a great conversation with Tim Cale, which is coming up tonight. But I would like to introduce you to the panel. Bryan Curtis, who I mentioned, a wonderful writer. If you read his pieces on The Ringer or anywhere else, he takes you to where the story is. You can be anywhere in the world, but if you allow yourself to read Bryan's work, he will take you on that journey with him. And there's nothing more special about any writing that can bring you to where the story wants you to be. And he's expert at that, having, as I said, worked with Bill Simmons for a long time at Grantland, at ESPN before that. And Slate was where you started? That's right. First gig in New York City, coming from Fort Worth, Texas. And he'll be talking to Russell Jackson, who's one of my favourite Australian writers. Russell's journey to being a sports journalist and a sports writer is different. Russell started by writing a blog. It was so damn good he couldn't be ignored, and now he's employed full-time as a sports writer, chief sports writer at The Guardian. His pieces are thoughtful, they're wonderfully well-informed, and he also has found his own voice by writing about what he knows and what he loves, but also being prepared to confront assumed truths and to run against the tide, which in sports writing is a rare thing indeed. And Merryn Sherwood knows all about that too, because she was a sports journalist in Canberra for a long time before she went into the world of academia. And I know you mostly know about her because she's the one we'll be examining you as you go through your course, and her participation in this festival has been brilliant. Merryn, I want to thank you in particular because you've been here virtually every day, and I know you've got a huge workload back at university as well. So give them a big round of applause, and I hand you over to Russell and Merryn to talk to Bryan Curtis about the arts of long-form writing.
Okay.
Please clap, as Jeff would say.
So I guess it pays to start at the beginning of your journey to being a sports writer.
A journey.
Your journey. Now...
It's a reality TV word, isn't it?
Yes.
My journey.
Bryan.
Go ahead. Sorry.
What I want to know is when you were first turned on to the idea of literary sports writing and long-form sports writing.
Probably subscribing to Sports Illustrated when I was a kid. You know, I read all the sports sections of the newspapers in Texas, but then reading Sports Illustrated was really this idea that you could have longer articles and they could have some real literary merit, right? And then a lot of the columnists in Dallas when I was growing up were really, really great writers and really funny or really just turned phrase or even did puns in a funny way. And those are the guys that really made me want to do it.
And was that a matter of initially hanging on those opinions of those few. So you've talked about Skip Bayless, those sorts of guys that it was about their opinion and their mode of expression.
Yeah, I don't think I even remember their opinion so much as the way they wrote. You know, it would probably be hard for me. I mean, I certainly at the time reacted to them saying, well, this guy should be starting quarterback for the Cowboys as opposed to that guy. But really what I remember was the way they wrote about it and the way they kind of grabbed you, seemed to reach out of the newspaper and grab you by the lapels and kind of shake you and make you pay attention, which not a lot of newspaper writing did.
So you see that and say to yourself, that's what I want to do.
Yes, absolutely.
And the first step to doing that is?
The first step was writing some, I was terrified to go look at them. I think it was in 5th grade when I started writing for the children's section of my local newspaper. And we'd have one of those big things where famous baseball players would all get into a room, you know, for like a Legends night or something. And a writer from the paper would push little 12-year-old me right up in front and say, why don't you go ask Nolan Ryan a question, you know? And I'd go like this, you know, like I was. And I think I'd ask one question and then get an autograph or something and then write a story that was about that big in the paper. But that was the very first thing I did. And then when I went to high school, I worked on the paper and I was the editor of the school paper and sports editor. And that's where I really started interviewing coaches, getting yelled at by the coaches when they got mad at me, writing profiles of athletes at the high school. And that's when I really started becoming a sports writer.
So, I mean, we were just talking about this before, but, you know, you idolised sports writers growing up, newspaper writers.
Yeah.
But sort of since the high school paper, college paper, your career has actually really been in places that actually didn't exist when you were born.
Yeah, right.
So how does that, I guess, pan out to, you know, where you didn't think it would be when you started out?
I mean, that's the funny thing, right? It's like I think I grew up in a world of newspapers and magazines. And by the time I got to college, I realized I was never going to write for newspapers and magazines because they were all going away. And they were slowly, and they're still around, and they're still really good, the ones that are around. A lot of them are. But that the world was going to be online. And so I think, as you said, like I don't think I've ever worked for a place that existed when I was even in college. Like they didn't exist, and some don't exist anymore. But I think it's been great because the best thing about the new world is that you get to do a lot more work when you're young. In the old newspaper magazine world, you got hired when you were 22, right out of college, whatever that is. And then you had to do this like 10-year apprenticeship before you could really write a lot, you know, really get into the action a lot of times, maybe 5 years. And now in this new world we live in, you get hired at 21 or 22, whatever, and you just get to do a lot of work right away. And if you don't, then you're going to have your own blog and you get to do it. I mean, that didn't exist when I was a kid. You couldn't blog on your own. You couldn't tweet on your own. You couldn't have any kind of presence unless you really got to the show. So I think that's the biggest way.
So one of your first jobs you started up with Slate, which has just had its 20-year anniversary. And they sort of, their tagline kind of is that, you know, they kind of invented the internet or writing for the internet, right? Like that's what Slate did.
Amazing.
So did your writing change when you went from newspapers to Slate?
Yes. The biggest thing, Slate is and was an American website that wrote about the news. I was a sports editor there when I was 22 or 23. The biggest thing it did is our editor was all about the article should be as short as it can possibly be. This is like the opposite of long-form journalism, is short-form journalism, right? And he would say, you know when you read a long profile and you have all these quotes and you have the scene where you're meeting the subject, and then you have these 2 or 3 paragraphs we call the nut graph, which tells you what the story is about. Just write the nut graph. That's it. That's the whole story. Just about 800 condensed words, and that's it. And it was a really great exercise because the thing it taught me is not, and I still have today, is reflexively, I don't want to be long. I don't want to go on too long. I want to be just as lean and mean as possible and then stop before people get tired of reading it and get bored.
At the same time, was that disheartening to think that you were entering this workplace where, having read those long features in Sports Illustrated and had these ambitions, that you were immediately being told shorter is better?
No, because I couldn't have done the long thing even if I wanted to.
Right.
I would have been terrible. And you know, I think you had to. People start in all kinds of ways. There's no proper way to do it. But for me, to start was to start small. Here's something I can do. Now it would probably be a blog post, right? This is essentially what these were. I'm going to learn how to do that, and then I can do this bigger one and a bigger one, and finally do a big story that could actually hold somebody's attention.
As far as the students here, I think something that they would probably want to know is what was the step between, now we just went from high school straight into your first job.
Yeah.
If you can describe your college years and how formative they were in your writing.
They're obviously very formative. I worked on the college newspaper. Mostly didn't do any sports. I wrote for the op-ed page and wrote a lot of, very serious, like they would want to tear down a campus building and build a business there, and I would write the really nasty editorial. How dare you, deface our campus that way? We're students here. We need more safe spaces for students. That kind of stuff. Also, be terribly embarrassing to actually go find those stories now. And then the big thing is I just started thinking about what I was going to do afterwards. So I did one internship. In particular, it was actually in TV at ABC in America, at the American ABC, at a show called Nightline that came on after the news. It was a national news show. And it was really great because it was in Washington, D.C. It got me experience there. Told me, without a doubt, I didn't want to work in television, even though I really enjoyed it. But it was a great experience. And then from there, I applied to jobs when I got out of college.
Sure. In that process of moving into the workplace, were there mentors for you that were important as far as your career?
Guy at the local paper in Fort Worth named Jeff Gwynn, who's now a best-selling author nationally in the United States, written biographies of Charles Manson and Bonnie and Clyde and all kinds of great true crime things. Was terrific when I was a kid. The executive producer of Nightline, a guy named Tom Batag, was wonderful. And then as soon as I got into the regular, actual paid workforce, all the people I worked for, my first couple of editors were really great. A guy named Jack Schaefer, who's now the press critic at Politico, hired me at Slate, and he was just terrific and still is a mentor and really taught me how to think and write. And he was a guy who would put, on the old days of Microsoft Word, I'd get my story back and there'd just be red lines seemingly through every line. And then there'd be red text that he wrote for me, and that would be the story, And I learned, I learned how to do stuff.
So what was that step going from college to the job? How did you actually get it?
I actually got an internship. So my mom is a high school counselor, and so she was always said, "Now, Bryan, you can be a journalist, but journalists in America, the starting salary is like $18,000 or $19,000 a year. Now, if you want to be a lawyer," she was being very clever, the starting salary is like $60,000 or $70,000. Now, I'm just giving you the options. I'm just laying it out there. So I showed her, because my first job I made $13,000 a year, not even 18. I just wrote away for an internship at the New Republic magazine. This is actually before Slate. And it was a 9-month-long internship, paid $300 a week. I was a young intern, and I did this great thing where every month I paid a different bill. One month it was my rent, the next month it was my cable TV and my phone. The next month I would go back to the rent because I hadn't paid for the previous month, and then they'd be calling to try to turn off the television and cancel the phone service, and I pay that. So it was kind of like a shell game. Pretty sure I committed a number of financial crimes that year. But I got through the year, and then I got my first job after that.
Right.
And what was, I guess, because I guess a lot of these guys in the audience here are about to graduate and try to find a job.
Doesn't that sound
How
fun?
was the kind of connection, or did you just apply randomly, or did you know people?
I didn't know anybody. I was in Washington, and I didn't know, and I just looked it up in a book in those days and sent it away. But I had an internship in Washington, so and then I flew up there to interview when they picked my application out of a stack. But the big thing was having internship experience was big because they knew, well, he's done an internship in television in Washington. We think he can handle this. At least he can show up every day and wear the right clothes and show up on time and do what he's told to and that kind of stuff. That was really, really big.
Now, I want to sort of get into the writing process itself and talk about your process of writing these beautiful features you write at The Ringer. So what are the most common catalysts for you to write about something?
The way I get ideas?
Yeah.
I don't think there's a good answer to that question. I think the answer is just anything. The ideas are just utterly, utterly random. And that's I think the best way to think about ideas in writing is to think you just embrace that it's going to be random. You're going to hear about it from a friend. You're going to hear about it from your parents. You're going to hear about it from a coworker. You're going to read an article and it's going to be one line 3/4 of the way through and you think, well, that actually would make a really good article. This article is about something else, but that one line seems like it would be good. You read an old book about sports writing or sports and you find tucked away some little reference or footnote that you think, well, what is that? What's that about? So I think the biggest thing for me is just to sort of learn that there is no great place to get ideas. Everything is a great place to get an idea.
And when you're assessing those ideas, do you favour things maybe that nobody else has written before?
Yeah, if possible, yes. Because I think it just feels more fun to write about things. So, I can think in journalism that doesn't happen all that much, right? Almost everybody's been written about. Almost everything. If you're writing about popular people, right, almost everything has been done. It's also kind of harrowing when you write about something that's never been done because there's no paper trail for you to follow, right? You can't get online and find 10 other articles to read and get yourself up to speed. It's a little scary to do that sometimes.
Is it also about trying to be different from what else is out there? I guess we talked before.
Yeah.
So that, when everyone was doing Muhammad Ali obituaries, you wrote a piece about how Ali had changed sports writing. So I guess taking that newsworthy angle and writing something different, was that a choice in your mind that you wanted to do something different?
Yeah, choice. I mean, it's I remember just sitting there and sweating for 20 minutes trying to think, what am I going to write? The most famous athlete in the world has died. He actually died at night in the United States, and I remember I had to drive like 45 minutes home and then stay up all night trying to think of something to say about Muhammad Ali, right? So it was just really scary was the reason. But yeah, I think working at Slate and then other places, the whole idea was newspapers have already done the basic story. You're going to come in from the outside, and you have to say something different. You have to add something to the conversation. I'm not going to go to President Obama's press conference and say, the president today made a statement about gun control. Somebody else did that already. I have to come in and say, what does a statement about gun control mean? How should we think about this? What should we look at this? And so that's what I think I've been doing that my whole career, including now.
And is it something like at the Riyadh that you think, well, of course, Muhammad Ali is one of the greatest athletes ever. I have to write about this, or is there ever a moment where you think back and think, I could maybe sit this one out?
That was. I wish I could have sat that one out because that was something where we all looked at each other, and we have a staff that's mostly under 35 years old. And none of us saw Muhammad Ali fight. So now what do we do? Well, Curtis, you're 38. You didn't see him fight either, but at least you've been around longer enough to maybe have read a couple more Muhammad Ali related books than everybody else. I think that was pretty much how that one got decided. I think also, it's like one of those moments when you're sitting in a meeting, you're like, I have an idea. Do I raise my hand and work all night? Or do I just sit on my hands and maybe somebody else will get this assigned? I think I did raise my hand. And that's why I got to do that.
Is it true to say in some of those situations that necessity breeds invention?
Yes,
and that
all of those situations.
The pressure of the deadline sometimes produces work that if you were given a lead time to produce something, you might to and fro, and that piece just really quickly nailed it. It wasn't long, but it was something different, as you said, and it's just that short time that you've got to do it that sometimes breeds that.
Yeah. I think deadlines are the best thing and the scariest thing in journalism. They're the best thing because, in a way, it's so freeing, right? If I tell you have a year to write a story, you'd say, gee, that's great. I have a whole year to do it. But then about 6 months in, you think, boy, wouldn't I like to be doing something else? Maybe today I'll take a day and go to the beach. And then, if you have 20 minutes to write a story, you're going to have to use every second, or let's say an hour. 20 minutes seems pretty short. If you have an hour to write a story, you have to have every minute to get it done. Every minute. And then at the end of the hour, it's going to be done, for better or worse, and then you move on to the next one. I've been doing this lately because I have to write about the debates in the United States, and everybody's watching the debates, right? So it's just, you have to get up the story pretty quickly right when it ends. So I'm thinking, like, what's the best thing I can write in 40 minutes? Of course, I've been taking notes during the whole thing, but it's just like I'm just mainlining Diet Coke and just thinking, like, just hoping my brain will work and hoping I don't make some terrible mistake. But yeah, I think it is wonderful. I think deadlines are wonderful.
Just something on that, though, because you said before, an interesting thing, you didn't watch Twitter during the debate, so you didn't see what was happening. So maybe tell us about, I guess, why you didn't engage.
We've had some veteran journalists, I would say, come up on this stage during this thing who seem a little suspicious of the web and Twitter and everything else. I don't dislike Twitter. In fact, I love Twitter. I think the only downside of it is when there's a giant public event like the Super Bowl, the Premiership, if I may use an Australian example, and everybody's on Twitter, you kind of get this hive mind kind of thing where everybody starts making the same jokes, and people start making jokes to impress other people on Twitter. I'm pretty sure it's sort of like a flock of birds all kind of flying together. So when there's a big thing like the debate, I just don't look at it because I just want to write what I'm going to write without trying to, because I think what happens is you read Twitter and you think, here's what everybody's saying. Now I'm going to just turn the dial 5 degrees and write something just a little bit different, but it's going to be just like everybody else, just to please everybody else. I think I don't want to do that. I just want to write, do my own thing, And then I look on Twitter, and of course I'm terrified when I do. What did I miss that everybody else was saying? I think it's better to do that.
There are times when you're reacting to an event, especially with sport, there's a certain amount of the results of sport that are to an extent predictable. And sometimes you can pre-prepare a little bit of material, but often it catches you out trying to do that. Do you ever find that it's possible to do that, to have in your mind mapped out what you were going to write before something happens?
Yes, it's possible, but it's very dangerous, because what you do is, if you think the Cowboys are going to win the football game, you spend 2 or 3 quarters thinking you're writing your Cowboy story on your head, and maybe you even get on your keyboard and start writing it. And then all of a sudden the Chicago Bears win the game in the 4th quarter, and you go, oh, why did I do that? But it's hard not to cheat, because you really want to be as good as you can. Again, you want more time. You want more time to process it. So yeah, it's good and bad. I think you can always tell when a writer has guessed wrong, because they write, well, the Chicago Bears won, but here's some great thoughts about the Cowboys, And it's always pretty apparent.
Yes. As far as rules for yourself, as far as subject matter goes, I had an editor once who used to say he had one rule, and that was never write about fans. Now, I didn't totally agree with that, but that was his rule. Do you have any rules for yourself, things that you just won't write about?
I have tried to stay away from touching stories. People with. There are lots of good things. I don't mean to make light. There are plenty of good stories about people with deadly diseases or overcoming alcoholism or things like that. I have mostly I've actually written a couple of those lately, in fact.
Yeah.
But I've tried to stay away from those, because I feel like I know how those stories go.
Right.
I know the trajectory of those stories. I can hear the violin music playing when I read the first paragraph, even write the first paragraph of it. So I just try not to do that, because it just strikes me as kind of that those stories will get written whether I write them or not.
Sure, and that feeds into my next question, which is about that sometimes an uninspiring idea can lead to a great piece, and vice versa. That, as you say, this inspiring narrative device of someone overcoming alcoholism or whatever it is, that sometimes that just leads you in a direction that you could see from the start.
And it traps you, because tonally, how do you write about that? There's pretty much one tone, right? Respectfully. Maybe sadly, maybe a little maudlin. Whereas some other story that was just a neutral idea, let's say about fans, could be funny or sad or silly or weird or just the facts, right? And you actually, I think, have more ways to go with a story like that, which is kind of what I like.
I'm interested to find out, I guess, a little bit about the story of how stories work at the Ringer. So maybe from idea to actually getting published on the site, what happens?
I usually tell my editor what the idea is. Sometimes before I tell them, I'll make some calls or do a lot of research to see if there's an idea there, especially if it's something unfamiliar. If it's one of these strange ideas, I'll do something so that I can go to them and say, this is why this would make a good idea. Sometimes I'll write a proper pitch, which is like a big long email that says, here's what the story would be about, here is the tension in the story, here are the issues we're getting into, here's how long it would take me, here's my game plan, basically. A lot of times it'll just be one sentence, if we think it's obvious. How about a profile of so-and-so, if it's a really famous person, right? I'll go off and do it. I'll hand it in. It gets edited. Then I'll take it back and usually do a lot more editing myself, much, much more than the editor will do. And then I'll hand it back, and then usually that version is pretty good to go, minus some minor things. We'll then have some copy editing, a little fact checking. I'll do most of that myself too. And then the story goes up. And then we go on to the next one.
You were saying before that in the edit, when you get it back, you sometimes might cut out, say, 500 words, which seems like a lot, for a piece that might not be that long. I mean, so I'm interested to, I guess, how that perception of what the story is shifts in between that.
I think I just try to be a savage editor of myself. That's the biggest thing. I read writers all the time who say this. They say, I'm not a great writer, but I'm a really good self-editor. So I don't know if I can write that well, but when I edit myself, I really edit myself well, right? And I think of myself that way a lot of the time. It depends on the story. But I would say when I'll hand in a draft, Calvin Trillin, who used to write for the New Yorker, still writes the New Yorker, used to call his first draft his vomit out draft. Like he was just vomiting out the story, and it was just to get it out, which is probably pretty similar to what mine are. Then when I get back the second draft, usually I will change it 40 to 60%. So not just cutting 500 words out of it, but literally rewriting whole sections of it. And it wouldn't be unrecognizable, but it would be a lot better, and it would read a lot better.
Does that make the editors angry that they've done all this work to the other piece and then you
No,
change it?
because
60%?
I think they at this point know that that's going to happen, so they probably scale back the work they do, and they'll make a lot of notes and say like, what if you led the story like this, and then trust me to execute it. But yeah, I mean, I think, and I'll print it out a whole bunch of times. I have this weird thing where every time I'll do a draft, I'll just print it out and read it on paper. And somehow the difference between reading it on a screen and reading it on paper makes you see things that you didn't see it on the screen. And even just like a page of it at a time. So at the end, I'll sometimes wind up with 75 pages. I put them in a shredder because I don't want anyone to ever find these. Not that anyone would ever care. But I'll wind up with like a stack of 75 pages that I'm then feeding into a shredder like Nixon at the end of it, because not because they're incriminating, but because I don't want anybody to ever read the crappy version I did at the beginning.
Sure. This brings to mind something that I read, a John McPhee piece about omission in writing and how sometimes the skill in writing is not everything that you gather together and put on the page, it's what you leave out. So I'm interested to know your process as far as, I know you're a copious taker of notes and you're very, you interview a lot of people for a lot of these stories and gather all of this data that's going into the story, the process of what you omit.
The biggest change I underwent as a journalist when I was a young journalist, I didn't know how to report. So everything every bit of reporting would wind up on the page, and it would be just barely sufficient for an article. So I got better at reporting. I had the opposite problem. I had this Pacific Ocean of things that I had found, all these wonderful things, and then it was a matter of cutting it down and not basically writing a Wikipedia entry for everything. And I think online now, one of the problems with online journalism is, since there are no word counts, people just throw the whole kitchen sink at something. Instead of saying, what's the cut of this that a regular person would actually like to read and would actually make it, not somebody who's just a crazy completist, but somebody who actually just wants the story. I'd say it almost all comes in the editing. I'll usually put way too much into the first draft.
Sure.
And then I'll realize that they don't need this curlicue and this curlicue and this curlicue, and they don't need this section at all. And then it just becomes about readability. It's mainly just readability. You put in as much as you can get away with. But reading it, printing it out, I'll imagine I'm a reader reading this and think, oh, this is boring.
Sure.
This is boring. You don't want to write. You don't want to say this. And that's when most of that omission stuff comes out.
And so in that sense, it's important that your ego is not too extreme, I guess, that you can objectively say to yourself, I like this piece of information, but it doesn't fit with this piece.
Yeah.
And to just let that go.
And if you've done your research right, it's great because you have so many. And I'll sit there and think, oh my gosh, I found this great thing, this great quote, this great piece of data, this great fact that I can't put in there. But then I realize you've already put in enough, and people will enjoy those, or they'll be satisfied with those. So it's okay.
Sure.
And again, it's a matter of if you've done enough research, it doesn't hurt your feelings quite as much.
I think that's something that we can really struggle with as young writers, though, is writing these beautiful sentences that then we have to cut.
Yeah.
Is it just time? Are there any other strategies you can give us for getting over ourselves?
For getting over yourselves. That's a good question. I think one thing is ask your partner, your mom, your dad, after they read an article you wrote. Say, what do you remember about this article? 2 minutes after they read it. They'll almost never say what you thought was the really great, funny line. They'll almost never mention it. Normal people don't think like that. They don't read in the way that we write things as journalists, right? They don't, sometimes maybe the line will be so good that that's what they'll think is really funny. But often I find they just pick something totally different. So why am I so worried about that one line when no one will remember it anyway? Yeah.
As far as story ideas go, there's the old cliche, write what you know. Now, to an extent, you do that in that you write about the great old sports writers, you write about sports media. That's an area of expertise in which you excel. But Do you find sometimes that you refresh yourself in your writing by venturing into the unknown?
Yeah, I like to take it. A lot of the times it comes from assignments from editors. When they do give me assignments, or they say, would you like to, is this something you'd be interested in? I almost always say yes, unless it's something I'm just completely bored or I don't think I can do, because it forces me to do it. And when you say old sports art, it's true. I write a lot about that. But what'll happen is I'll say, I've written about Boston sports artists. We'll say, well, go write about this guy in San Francisco. And it's a guy I've never read, never met, don't know anything about. So while I'll understand the structure of how the media works, I don't know anything about this person. Sure. I've never met him. I've never talked to him in my life. And so it still feels very much like venturing into the unknown, and doing something I just don't have any experience with.
One story that you talked about the other day was the piggyback bandit. Now, in that instance, that was the case of an editor coming to you with a wacky story and saying, I think you should follow this up, and you did. If the shoe was on the other foot and that was something you were pitching, and I guess this is helpful for students to know, is how do you get a really crazy idea that might not make sense to an editor? How do you get those ones over the line, the fun stories you want to do?
That's a good question. I think, the cheesiest and easiest way to do it is to compare it to something that already exists. Like a joke about the movies, right? It's Spies Like Us meets Apocalypse Now, right? Like you take, one thing you can do with editors is say, how so-and-so wrote this great story, this great true crime story? I have something that's a little bit like that. Here's this, So in the editor's mind, they're associating with something that's already been done. The other way with something like the Piggyback Bandit would just be to really talk about how am I going to report this. Most of the time, editors may like an idea, but they want to say, what can you bring to this? What would you go do? Where would you get on a plane and fly to? What would you report? How would you tell the story? So I think just kind of writing the stage directions as much as you can, especially if it's going to be something that's kind of like travel intensive and they're having to buy plane tickets.
Yep.
That's what I would say would be the biggest thing.
I think it might be interesting for this audience, maybe if you could maybe explain a little bit about that story and how it came to be.
We talked about this a little bit the other day. Yeah. But there was a guy in the Pacific Northwest of the United States who was I think he was in his early 30s or late 20s at this point. And he was showing up at high school sporting events. And he was asking the players to give him piggyback rides. Okay? He doing this once or twice, and then he did it 4 or 5 times. Then he began getting arrested for this because he was doing it in kind of a creepy way. And started getting banned from entire states. He could no longer go to sporting events in Washington State, in Oregon, and Montana. And he became known as the Piggyback Bandit. And there was like a security camera photo of him in the AP story. And so my editor came to me and said, would you like to write about the Piggyback Bandit? Would you like to go on the trail of the Piggyback Bandit? And I said, okay. That sounds different. And so with that story, there had been enough wire stories out there that I knew where to start. I knew people to call up. I knew people that had seen him. There are also police reports. So it was a great source of information for tracking his movements. But the big question was, and reporting stories like that, is why is he doing this? And, this doesn't make any sense. Is this just really, really weird, or is there some buried explanation for why he's doing this? And so that was, start out like, I know I can do the scenes. In fact, I went state by state watching. I literally followed him across the country. But finding the why of it was the challenge in that respect. I
mean, I guess something like that is not a traditional sports story, and you're someone that doesn't write a whole lot of traditional sports stories. Has it been fun for you to, I guess, meet this online environment that allows you to tell those stories?
Yeah. I mean, it would have never worked in a newspaper. And it never would have worked on Sports Illustrated, for that matter, most of them. But the great part about the online world is that you can do these kinds of things. Sometimes people do them, I think, too much. Sometimes I probably do them too much. Where it's just being weird and, there's like A stories, right? The news of the day. And there's B stories and C stories. And sometimes I think you can get too into the B and C stories and never push yourself to do something that's right in the middle of the action. But yeah, I think the online community is very welcoming of that because people like to read things like that. And once you have a national audience thanks to Twitter, you find enough people that want to read stuff like that you may have not been able to find in the old days.
You say people want to read that stuff. how often is the intended audience considered when you pitch a piece?
Not much. I mean, I just think what I would want to read, or maybe a couple of my friends who are, open-minded sorts, maybe my wife. Like I would think about like what would they like? Would they be interested in this? Sure. Is this so arcane that if it was only interesting to me, I probably wouldn't write it. But if is this something that I would really like to read if I were a normal reader of newspapers and not or normal reader of the media and not a writer of the media? Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Something I want to get into is your interviewing process, which I've seen firsthand a little bit this week. But if you could maybe talk about the fundamentals of the interview process that leads to all these great quotes and these great anecdotes that appear in your pieces.
How do you interview people? First thing is to know a lot about your subject before you interview them, right? That's the biggest thing. If you go in with no information, you're kind of faking it. And I think we all have to do that because journalism moves so quickly that a lot of times we have to do an interview before we're really ready to do it. You write somebody an email and they call you 2 minutes later. Oh crap, I wasn't ready for this. I was hoping you'd call me tomorrow. Now what do I do? The biggest thing is to first of all know a lot of information. And the second thing is really rehearse your questions. There's just I think that's the biggest lesson for me as a journalist is you can't, maybe I'm just not talented at it, but I can't just come up with questions on the fly. I have to really understand what do I want from this person? And then to be very explicit about it. Here's what I don't understand. Can you explain to me why this is the case? Do you have a theory about why this was the case? I was just asking you this a few minutes ago. Can you tell me what it is about this person? And then sometimes when I'll do a profile piece, I'll be like, what is somebody who's a good friend who they worked with, let's say a colleague at a newspaper for 30 years. What does he look like? How would you describe the way he talks? Right? Because maybe the person talks in a funny way. What did their desk look like? What did he dress like? Just questions like that. They don't even have to be really interesting or, too particularly profound. What was his ambition as you would describe it? And if the person is a willing interview subject, they'll take those prompts and just run with it. But it has to be a question, and it has to be something that I really want to know, and it has to be something that, gives them enough of a push to push in the right direction.
And I think you made an interesting point there as far as for young writers establishing a scene and in describing someone in detail. Quite often that requires asking those specific questions because there'll be a piece of yours that, say it talks about a schlubby reporter with unkempt, and you describe his office and these things. That information doesn't tumble out of people. You specifically have to ask it. And that's invisible in the end piece, but those are simple, sharp questions that sometimes take people by surprise but allow you to set the scene.
Yeah, it does take people by surprise. I think it's very funny. Somebody will say, what did he look like in the 70s? I'll say, well, you've seen pictures of him, haven't you? And I'm thinking, well, yeah, I literally know what he looks like, but I want you to tell me what you thought he looks like. One exercise you can do is get a novel. It can be anything. Look at a way a person's described and think, how journalistically would I find out all that information, right? I could find photographs, but I could also find people to help me figure it out, right? I could also find things that I couldn't find in a photograph. What did his office smell like, right?
Sure.
What was the mess like on his desk? How did he talk on the phone? I'm writing about a sports writer right now, and somebody told me every time I'd walk in the newsroom, this guy was known as a great reporter. He was on the phone like this going, tell me something I don't know, to his subject on the other end of the line, right? You only get that from talking to people. And that was, so that's just, it's just really, really simple, specific questions.
Sure.
And if you think that because in this day and age we kind of get caught up in the long, complicated questions.
Yeah. People always want to ask long, complicated questions, don't they? Because I think this is another problem. You want to seem really smart to the person you're writing about. So if you ask really long, complicated questions, you think, oh, I'm going to really impress them with this. Who cares if you impress them? That's the other thing. I think we were talking about this a little while ago. I will listen to interview tapes, and the time I hate the sound of my own voice on an interview tape. Let's please hope this isn't being taped today. But the one thing I always hate is when I'm trying to impress the subject. He says something or she says something, and then I interject. Oh, it's just like when something. Now, all I've done is unloaded some dumb thought in my head and tried to impress the subject, but in fact, all I did was make them stop talking. Or they now are reacting to this new thing that I said instead of what they were saying before. And I've just ruined a moment, a potential goldmine of information.
And on that note, do you find that sometimes awkward pauses help? Because there's this natural inclination as humans that we don't want awkwardness. So we don't allow silence, and I'm doing it right now. I'm still talking. I'm not letting you answer. But if I did that and just left silence, perhaps that would be awkward, but some interesting thought would come flowing from you. Yes.
A mistake I think we make as journalists is we want an interview to be a friendly exchange. We want it to be like a conversation, almost like you're on a date, right? If you're on a date, you wouldn't want any silence, right? If your date was sitting there awkwardly silent, you would say something to fill the space. Oh my gosh, don't walk out of the bar. I'm not ready. I'm not that bad. I'm not that. But with journalistic encounters, they don't need to be smooth. They don't need to be this perfect. We're not on television here. We're not doing a 60 Minutes interview, right? They need to be informational. The only important part is that you get the information right. You don't ever have to post your tape online, hopefully, right? So a lot of times you can pause. Sometimes I'll just be a thing where I am literally, they're sitting there silent, where I'm literally looking through the list of questions I have to make sure I haven't forgotten anything. Or I'm thinking about how can I ask this in a different way because maybe I asked it the wrong way. Yeah. And that's perhaps a misunderstood luxury of writing as opposed to interviewing someone for radio or TV, is that you can have all those awkward moments, you can revisit things, and you can really prod people for, if their answer is insufficient, you can return to it and try and coax more information out of them. Absolutely. I think the thing is, you want your interview subjects to feel at ease, I think. You want them to feel like they can talk to you. But you don't necessarily have to be their friend, and I think you probably don't want to be their friend. And you don't want to treat, with friends, if you and I were sitting there talking and there was something bad that had happened in your life, I may kind of navigate around it because I don't want to put you uncomfortable. I don't want to say, if Russell doesn't want to talk about it, I don't want to ask him about it. Well, the subject, that's the opposite of what we want to do, right? We want to go right to the uncomfortable thing because that's the important part of the story in almost every case, right? So we don't need to be friendly like that. We need to assume a thing where I'm trying to get information and hopefully you're giving it to me.
Sometimes as sports writers, I think too, there's that question where you might be interviewing someone where you've grown up being a lifelong fan.
Yes.
And then you go and interview them, which can be a bit uncomfortable. Have you had experiences like that?
Yeah, a few. I mean, a lot of it's been with sports writers, actually, and sports broadcasters that I've watched on TV my whole life. And then I had to go interview them. And I think I probably did worse in those cases than anything else because I really didn't probably want to upset them and everything like that. But I think, again, it goes back to your preparation. Do you know what you want out of this encounter, right? It doesn't have to be a hard-hitting interview where they're just crying and beating on the table like a police interrogation, right? But what is the story? If this person who's this great athlete who I've loved my entire life, what do I want to know from him? What's the thing I've always wanted to know? There's probably something, right? Maybe it's in a friendly context. There's probably something I always want to know about, some great game he had, or the way he does something, or something like that, right? If you know that going in, I think it'll be a better interview. As far as the physical interviewing process, we had Martin Flanagan talk on Friday. One piece of advice he gave me was, if you can, always travel and always see the person. Yes. Interview people in person. Have you found that that's more rewarding? Absolutely. Absolutely. It's also longer. Yep. If you sit down with somebody at their house or for lunch, it's almost always going to last at least an hour. Sometimes it'll last hours and hours and hours and hours. Phone conversations usually don't last hours. And when was the last time you talked on the phone to somebody for 3 hours, right? It just very rarely happens. Also, I think it puts them at ease more than anything else because a strange voice over the phone is a lot weirder than a strange voice sitting right in front of you. And it just makes them much more comfortable. Yes. I always want to do that, if I can. And that there's probably something in that when faced with a human being, it feels like a lot of people, you'd probably be less inclined to say something nasty about them when you've spent time with them and sat face to face with them. The writer, you mean? Yes. As a writer? Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe even if you would, you would at least feel some empathy when you sat down to write it, so that you would understand what their perspective was, even if you disagreed with them at the end of the day. Yeah, I think so. Sure, that's hard, but it's probably something you should get over if they're, they need to be criticized.
So when you walk into the room to sit down and interview someone, do you kind of have like a general kind of opening or something to try and put your interviewee at ease?
Probably, I want to explain to them what I'm trying to do. Most of the people I interview, are pretty famous, and even the ones that aren't famous, the biggest thing when you interview people, the biggest thing they want to know is what do you want? What are you doing? What is this story about? And as much as you can, you don't have to give the whole game away. You don't say, here's my thesis. Do you agree with this? But you can kind of say, look, I want to understand. I know X and Y, but I want to know Z, right? Or I want to understand this about you. So putting that out there, it also just helps to cut right to the heart of the matter, so that you're not doing 18 preliminary questions before you ask what you really want to ask. If you say, this is what I want to know, you'll just start talking about it right away. And you'll get right to the meat of the issue, I think.
I think one thing that's confusing to people when they start maybe writing features is the split of, you'll talk to people on the record, but you'll also talk to people off record.
Yeah.
And I'm interested to know in how, like, the ratio of that for you.
Almost 90% on the record.
Sure.
And it may be because of the stories I do. I think there's way too much off the record in sports writing. I mean, it's so ridiculous. We're in the middle of trade week, right? Sources close to the team say, right, this is what this is about. A couple of Hawthorne sources can tell me, and I can now report exclusively. That in that context may make sense, but I think for most people, it just becomes this crutch. And most of the time, people, when they say, "Can I go off the record?" then they say something that's just totally uncontroversial. And oftentimes, I think what you can do is if they insist on that, you can then take down the quote and then go back to them and ask them if you can put it on the record. Tell them how what you're using it. Read it back to them, reassure them, and say, "Look, it's not going to be so bad," But if they have to, and they can convince me that it's important that it's off the record, I'll allow it. At least think about it. But most of the time, it's not. And I would just encourage, and I fight back, and I just say, come on. What's so controversial about it? Another thing subjects will always say is, maybe I shouldn't say this, and then you're about to get something really good, and you always say, oh, no, go ahead, say it, please say it.
Just as far as, now that's the ideal scenario when all of this information is flowing and they're being candid with you. How do you revive an interview that's going nowhere?
I think sometimes you can say that it's going nowhere. Most of the time people that have talked to you are trying to help you. They'll at least try to help you to a point. And maybe an athlete in the locker room is like, man, I got to get home. I don't care, whatever it is. But if you're sitting down for something if the person knows you're writing a profile about them, and they're sitting down with you, they're mostly going to try to help you. So I think one thing you can do is say, look, I'm just not understanding this at all. I hear what you're saying, but I don't get it. And I think if I write what you're telling me, people are not going to understand it. So I want to write it correctly. I want to get, people are just going to say the same things they've always said about you if I write that. So what's the real answer here? Push them a little bit.
And that goes back to what you said earlier about saying to people, help me understand this.
Yeah.
And positioning yourself as the helpless, person adrift,
and
trying to understand this.
And it is positioning, but it's also not. There's two things. One is that I really don't, most of the time, I really don't know. I really don't know what I'm talking about. But I think also if you think of journalism in a non-cynical way, you really are trying to figure something out. Now, some people don't want to be figured out, but you can say, look, I'm just really trying to figure out whatever it is. That's all I'm doing. And you may not like it, but that's what I really want to do. And if you can convince them that you're really doing that, and you are, in your heart, really doing that, they will try to help you, again, to a point. Or maybe not. But most of the time, I think that they will.
Do you think it's kind of difficult now, though, that you also write kind of opinion and commentary pieces? And then if you switch back and do reporting, that
Yeah.
people might have kind of this conception that you're just going to write whatever you want to, you're going to pass judgment.
Yeah, I mean, some people will come back and say, well, you wrote, or you know what, it's worse than the opinion and commentary piece is you tweet something. I'll tweet something about an announcer on television, aha, look at the idiot who said this, and then you have to go to that person and ask for an interview, right? And they remember the tweet. That's like the new thing in journalism, I think, is tweeting is so fast, and then you're like, oh wait, I actually need that person to help me. Yeah, I think it's an occupational hazard, but I also think at the same time, if you feel that way, you should just write it, and you should worry about the access later, right? And I think some people are very sensitive, but a lot of people who say, look, I felt that way when I watched it, but I also am interested in this other subject about you. Fairly open to it. They're used to criticism, right? Famous people are, so maybe they can get over it.
You just mentioned access then. As far as your interview process for your pieces, how easy or hard do you find it to access the people you need for those?
I always ask them first, the subject first, most of the time.
Sure.
Because I think if I'm not going to get to talk to this person, how really badly do I want to write the story? If I'm going to have to write it around, or write around, right, as we say, right? If I'm going to have to just do it without the subject's cooperation. I find it pretty easy. I write about media subjects. They're not as closed off as athletes, right? I'm not trying to go over to LeBron James's house for 10 hours a day, all the time. But I always insist to them that, one thing you can always do is say, well, when we say, how much time do you need? And say, well, so-and-so gave me a full day. Sure. And name one of their colleagues. And I say, well, if he gave him a whole day, then that must be okay, right? I mean, when I was writing for The Ringer at first, I was worried that people would be like, what is The Ringer? I don't understand. I literally don't know what you're talking about. So getting a few people to agree to do long-form stories at the beginning was big, because then I could always send them to them and say, look, this famous person said yes, so why don't you say yes?
Mm-hmm. And as far as that, you mentioned the write-around, so have there been instances where you've thought, I've got to do a write-around, you ask a lot of people about this person you're writing about, and it gets back to that subject that you're asking all these people, and then you finally get the interview?
Yes. And I think that happens probably I think for me, and again, it's just a subjective sample, but it happens most of the time. Mm-hmm. Most of the time they give in, because they hear the questions you're asking, and they hear that they're genuine questions and legitimate questions. Also, by the way, is the other thing where the person says yes to an interview. You call all their friends before you see them, and the friends all report back every conversation you have to the person. So they're hearing everything you're asking about them, and that's kind of funny. It's almost like a high school or something, where they're telling on you, and like he hears everything that he asks, even the negative questions. But sometimes it sets them up, because then the person knows exactly where you're going to go.
Do you find there are instances where you actually want to do a write around though and not necessarily talk to the person? I mean, we were talking about the Frank Sinatra Has a Cold story before, that is the classic example of a write around that worked really well. Yeah. So
like, you're asking, I would decline to talk to them, and they wanted to talk to me, but I would decline to talk to them?
Or I guess, have there just been stories that actually you haven't got access, but it's turned out, you think, to be a better story because you've talked to people around them?
I think sometimes it can be a better story. I think it's interesting, because I think sometimes it can be your story can be have a sharper angle, like when it's told from the outside. It may be less correct. Ultimately, it may it may be a great opinion of the person, a great angled profile, but if you talk to them, you'd probably understand them a lot more. And then human beings are complicated, so you may not write as good a story. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's like, if you have a column, we could pick Tim Cahill's later tonight, right? So we could say, like, if you had to write a column about Tim Cahill, you might be able to write a real pointed, sharp story. But if you were up here for 20 minutes, it might be harder to write that, because now you have all this information. Now your sharp point is clouded a little bit. But yeah, so I think it can be good either way. It's just funny. It's kind of but it's a totally different form of story.
The writing process itself, so a lot of this is dependent on deadlines.
Yeah.
But do you reach stages in the interviewing and research process for a piece where you say, right, I'm now ready to sit down and start writing this thing. There's enough.
because you get too much. You find people are telling you the same stories.
Sure.
That's what happens, right? You've called enough people and they're just repeating they're like, oh, did you hear the one about it? You're like, yeah, I heard it 3 times already, so now it's time to start writing. You say some of this stuff is about deadlines. All of this stuff is about deadlines. Journalism is how good can it be before the deadline? Mm-hmm. That's all it is. It's not a novel, right? There was literally a deadline on everything, even if it's a long deadline. Mm-hmm. There's some point where you either have to pay the bills, the other's coming to get you. They're not going to come literally take the story away from you.
And that writing process, you say it's dependent on deadlines, of course, but what's a slow feature as far as the writing time, and what's a quick one?
Quick one is a week. A long one is 3 or 4 weeks for me. It can be longer too. Sometimes I'll put it away, do it into something else, then come back to it, so it winds up lasting a longer time. But I'd say like a month or something like that, maybe for 3 or 4 or 5 weeks.
And any longer than that, it gets stale? Or
it can get stale, yeah. I think there is a point where your notes just kind of sit there and it's hard to write. That's happened to me. Sometimes I put it off and then really regretted putting it off because somehow I think there's a magic in journalism that happens when you're in the moment. And we talked about the deadline magic where you just have to think. Sometimes I think of the same way with the profile. There's a magic because it's just all happening and your mind is working, you're seeing things, and it's all fresh in a way you can't even articulate. And it kind of comes roaring out. And if you wait too long, the magic kind of dissipates and then it's just harder to write it. Maybe you have to work yourself back into that frenzy somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we're talking about the writing process as well. So how do you actually physically write? Are you the person that just sticks yourself to your laptop with coffee, Diet Coke? Do you know?
I dip a quill pen and ink, bring out my fool's cap, and start going along. I'm not very good at sitting down and just doing it like that. I have to walk around a lot. So sometimes I'll write a page and then I'll print it out, back to the printing, and then walk out in the parking lot and do like a lap, right? I should wear one of those Fitbit bracelets, so I can see how many steps I do for every story. I think that would be helpful. There's that. The other thing we didn't talk about is like outlining, but by the time I sit down to write something, I usually have about 100 pages of notes. Some of those are pure interview transcripts, and at the top of them there's a lot of things like an idea and a story, and then it's all the evidence or support I've accumulated for that idea. And a lot of times there I'll have written out sentences, and sometimes it's just taking those sentences and just literally sticking them in the story. So I've already done a lot of, it's not just, here's word 1, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it just, again, it depends on deadline. How much do I have to sit down and drink Diet Coke and get it done? Do I have a week? Do I have a day? Hopefully the latter. So I can sit there and take my time. But yeah, there's a lot of writing. I just don't have enough of an attention span to sit there for 8 hours in a row and do it, to kind of mix it up a little bit.
And how many stories do you have on the go at once?
It's like 2 or 3, but they won't be well into it. Maybe like one that's really well done and one that I've started to send emails on and set it up so that it'll be ready to go when I finish it. I can't do too many. I just get too confused.
Do you ever get to the end where you just don't have anything and start to freak out?
You just don't have a story to write? Yeah, I guess it's happened. I think I'd pull the plug before that. Or I would just say, this is just a column. This isn't a long story. This is the other great thing about the internet is things don't have to be a certain length. It's like, I'm going to write a 3,000-word story. Oh, the interviews sucked. Well, it's a column now. It's a 1,000-word column.
So do you have like a set amount of columns, words, stories that you have to do for the Ringer in a week, month?
It's not set. I think if I disappeared into the hinterlands for more than a couple of weeks, they'd probably come looking for me and say, what are you doing? But, I try to do a couple of things a month at least, and then I wind up doing some stuff like the debate. So that adds to the numbers. But like significant things, probably like 1 or 2 a month.
And are there set outcomes for stuff? Like, is there a set number of things that have to go up every day?
At the Ringer?
Yeah.
Yeah. But a lot of that is driven by the news. So there's going to be a football game tonight, so we don't have something on the football game in the morning, right? There's going to be a debate tonight, so we don't have something later tonight on that. And then the bigger features kind of float between all those signposts.
As far as so you're writing a lot of features, but in between that, do you find it can refresh you to dash something off quick, an opinion piece?
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice to have the different experience, the sprint and the marathon, right? And they refresh each other. Because I always want to be writing whatever I'm not writing, you know? It's like it's a word this is what you do on deadline. I have a story about Tim Cahill. You know what I'd really love to be writing right now? Is a story about, you know, a cricketer. That's what I really, my gosh, I wish I were writing a story about a cricketer. So your mind, you know, it's just a way of trying not to do what you need to do. But I think when you do that, it actually takes kind of care of the problem for you a little bit and offers you that different experience.
Features, is there a structural principles that you follow in that, or it just kind of you've developed your style and it flows?
I don't know if it's a style. It's every one of them is so different, and it often depends on whether they're happening in history. You know, it's something that happened a long time ago. Whether I'm literally witnessing the events of it, whether it's mostly over the phone and I wasn't there. You know, the sort of typical thing with a feature is we start with a scene, right? On a cold November day in 1989, you know, Francis Leach walked up to, you know, his wife and gave her a hug and then headed off to meet his fate, you know, or something, you know. I just try to mix it up. You know, I do some of those. And then also I try to so I just don't want to start it the same way every time. I don't want it to be a Mad Libs cut and paste kind of thing. So yeah, I don't think there's like any kind of schematic or anything like that. And often I'll say, I know this has to be a section in it. I don't know where it's going to go, so I'll just write that, and then we'll figure out later where it's going to go. Maybe it'll be the end, maybe it'll be the beginning, maybe it'll be something in the middle, something like that.
Is that part of your notes? Do you try and sort of organise them and start to pull them together when you sit down to write and be sort of like, that's a section, I'll write that and then I'll put it in later? Is that how it works?
Yeah, I think when you get these when you start interviewing people, themes come about. Maybe it's an idea, maybe it's a scene, and you start thinking like, that would be great to have in a story. So then when you call other people, you're starting to tell me what you think about that idea, or help me flesh that out, or help me flesh out that scene. And then you may not know exactly where it's going to go, and then when all the notes are done, when all the research is done, then you can kind of put it in order. And then you have to see if it works. Sometimes you write that way and it just doesn't work. And then you have to move it around or start completely differently or something else, you know.
The lead. How important is the lead to the feature writing process for you?
Less important than it is in a column. If it's a column that's just 1,000 words, the lead is just, you know, to me that's almost everything, right? You have to just get the audience quickly and off we go. With a feature, you know, I think the audience knows it's in for, it's like when you sing a long movie, you know, you're not going to walk out of the movie after 2 minutes. So I don't think it's as important in a movie. I mean, in a feature. You want it to be gripping. You want it to be interesting. You want it in a way to set up what's going to come later. Yep. You don't want it to be just stupid and boring. But I think you have a little, I don't know, you just have a little more slack, I think.
And same goes for the kicker, for the finale?
But no, the kicker has to be good.
On the feature.
Yeah.
And what are the tips for making sure that that's good? Like buttoning off a piece.
What are the tips? I just think it should bring home whatever it is you're trying to say. You know, ideally. Sometimes it doesn't work like that. But ideally it should, you know, boom, you know, in the reader's mind. It should also be different. I don't think you should end a piece, you know, just the same way you began it, right? It shouldn't just say like, it shouldn't be like those bad term papers that we've all written. Say, and in some, here's what here's what I said at the beginning, right? It should ideally be something that extends the idea of the story, but is a different like piece of evidence or a different scene or something, right? I like doing something just at the end that just really, really pops.
Or a quote.
Yeah, sure. I think sometimes those are the best ones. Then you have to get a good quote that works there. It's kind of easy sometimes to end with a quote, right? Sometimes I want to do that every story. I say, okay, you have to write it this time, Curtis. You can't just let your subject say it.
Is there a balance of quotes and using quotes?
Yeah, there is. Quote. I think we live in this kind of society where we feel as journalists we have to quote people all the time. Sometimes we should just say it ourselves, right? Sometimes the athlete didn't say really anything really interesting at all. You know, oh my God. And if it's not a newspaper story, you should just write it. You know, if the athlete said something, well, I went out there and tried hard today, and gosh darn it, we didn't get it done. You don't need to write that. Like, who cares, right? You should use that time and space in the story to write something that you think is interesting, because you could write it much better than that. I used to have an old editor whose rule of using quotes was only use a quote when you couldn't say it better yourself. That doesn't work all the time, but I think it's a pretty good rule to keep in the back of your mind. It also depends, too, on the kind of subject. Sometimes people are really good talkers. If you have a subject who's a really good talker, you want to hear him or her throughout a story. You want to spend some time with that person. If it's a famous person, part of the fun for readers is to hear that person, right? It's like watching a TV interview. They want to spend some time with the person. If it's somebody who's really interesting but it's not a great talker, then they're probably not going to be in the story as much.
Do you ever find that you paraphrase people and then decide actually it was better in their own words?
No, I find I let them go on too long. I find that I quoted them at length and it should have been shorter.
Sure.
Usually when I'm between the first two drafts, I'll have a quote this long, and then by the second draft it's this long. And it's just it's actually the last sentence that they said, because that's enough and that's perfect. And we didn't need all the throat clearing and all the stuff that came before it.
How often when you finish a piece, is it a case of you've just stopped working on it? And how often do you just think, I've got this right on the money, this is it?
I wish I thought I was right on the money more times. Very, very rarely am I patting myself on the back. Very rarely. Once in a while. Once in a while, I think that's it. Yeah, you got it. Not very much.
So whose feedback matters the most?
My editor, Sean Fennessy. People on Twitter whom I really admire, who, it's actually not even Twitter, because Twitter is so much performance for other people. There's this thing, if I like a story, if I like your story or your story, sometimes I'm doing that because we're friends. Sometimes I'm doing that because I want to publicly show that liking your stories is a sign that I have really good taste, so I'm going to tell the world that I like your stories. Sometimes I'd like people to send you a note. The note has kind of disappeared from our world, right? We can't do anything that's not public. Somebody sends me an email, and it's somebody I really admire, or just a random person. A lot of times that is hits home a lot better. It's it makes me feel good. Russell sent me that one time when we didn't even know each other, and it made me feel really good, because I thought, here's a guy who I don't know, but across the world and reading a story I wrote and liked it, and bothered to send a note, and that just meant that. It's like an actual human connection. So I think that's the ones that I really, really like.
Do you delve into the comments?
Not much. I stopped reading my mentions in June, I think. I go every once in a while.
What was the tipping point?
The start of the Ringer.
Right.
Not that they're bad. I'm actually avoiding good mentions as much as bad mentions.
Sure.
Because I think if you read good mentions, you sit there feeling great about yourself, and you don't do anything for 2 days. You just float along on a cloud. Aren't I great? Aren't I? What did a wonderful job? And that doesn't help me. To think. It'd almost be better if they were all critical, because then I could at least go, okay, here's what I need to do next time, and then I'd be mad and want to write something else.
As far as reaction, now we're talking about the reaction of readers. Do you often get situations where you maybe get kickback from the subjects of pieces you write?
If I spend a lot of time with them, they'll almost always call me after the story or write me a long email.
Sure.
That's one of the things. When you do profiles, if you go report on the soccer game, usually, unless you write something totally incendiary, the subject's not going to call you back. They probably won't even read it. But if you spend a lot of time with somebody and write this giant piece, they're going to react to it. So I almost always hear back from them. And, I wouldn't say I get a lot of really negative reactions. Sometimes they'll have a point or two about something that they thought I got wrong. I'm not factually wrong, but they just thought I didn't understand, or they disagree with what I came to the conclusion of. But that's always kind of a harrowing moment. Because I know if it were me, if somebody were writing this long, long thing about me, and I would want to call them up afterwards, or talk to them, or email them at least.
And to what is the reaction more feral, sport or politics?
Sport, I think. think politicians are just so immune to this stuff. Politicians actually, this is the one difference. Politicians will have their PR people call up and yell at you a lot more. Sports PR people don't yell too much. I think they're just kind of politics, but you'll rarely hear from the subject. Hillary Clinton's not going to call up and say, "Gee, I was really hurt by what you wrote."
And then on the flip side of that, reader reactions, are they more unhinged to criticism of their sports team or criticism of their political party?
Politics is by far. I write debate stuff, and there'll be the ones. I guess I do read these mentions, and they'll say, "I can't believe you thought Trump won the debate." And literally in the second sentence, I wrote, "Trump didn't win the debate." It would just be like that much of a, and I'll just be like, do I want to spend all night tweeting at this person you didn't read the story, but thank you for your comment. I find with politics they're much more in the zone. Sports people at least give you a chance.
Do you think that's a recent thing though, just with this election cycle?
It's probably worse. But I remember writing politics in the early 2000s, and it was the same way. There's no room. People are just it's probably since 9/11 in the United States. There's our political parties are very, very, at odds with each other. There's not a lot of room in the middle.
One final one before we take some questions. A lot of the students here have probably been given a lot of doom and gloom stories about journalism, which I personally don't always agree with as far as the future of writing, feature writing in sports and these things. What would you say to them as far as how things are looking over the next, say, 5 to 10 years for sports writers online?
Yeah, I wouldn't doom and gloom it up at all. But I would say that it's going to be like me. I think it's really funny. The people that were in the 60 years before me or something, 80 years, they could grow up knowing they could know what they wanted to write for, and those media institutions were going to be around, and it was just a matter of whether they were good enough or lucky enough to do it. And I think you're probably if you really want to be a sports writer or sports broadcaster or podcaster or whatever it is, you're probably going to be fine if you really work at it and you have some talent. You're probably also going to be working in a way that we cannot sit up here on the stage and predict right now, right? We might not be able to understand how podcasts are going to be monetized. We might not know what sports websites are going to be. We don't know if there's going to be, a Herald Sun and an Age in 20 years. We don't know if there's going to be an Australian Grantland that's going to start tomorrow and is going to be the best thing ever and that everybody in this room is going to be working for, right? So I would say that it's not doom and gloom, but it's really unpredictable. And it's just one of those things where you just have to be willing to do. I think one of the things my friends and I all figured out a couple of years ago, and we're kind of the early web generation, which doesn't do us any credit, we just happened to come along at that time, is we think of our career in 3 or 4 year bursts now. I don't think this is where I'm going to be working for the next 20 years. I hope I'm working for the next 20 years, but logically you just think, here are the next 3 or 4 years, what I hope to do, and then after that I'm going to do something else.
Sure.
This may be, my ultimate goal may be to do this kind of journalism, but I'm not quite sure where I'm going to do it. But I think it's also the most exciting time in the world. I don't think there's any better time to be a sports journalist than right now. I absolutely don't. You couldn't convince me otherwise. And it's not just because I am right now. I just don't think if I were young, I'd be so excited to be coming into this world because it just, trust me, the newspaper and magazine days were not that great. There'll be guys who will sit up and may have even sat up on the stage and memorialized those days. But they were a lot stricter than we are now, and there's a lot more you can do now. Grantland, those kind of pieces could never have been written, or never have been written as consistently under the old world. And I think this is a great place, a great time to become a sports journalist. Absolutely.
All right, question time.
So just put your hand in the air and introduce yourself and ask away. So we've got some questions for Bryan.
How you doing? Simon, nice to meet you. Every fan that I speak to that read Grantland, like myself, obviously says it's the greatest thing ever. And every contributor who speaks in a podcast says it was the greatest thing ever. As someone who was involved, could you just detail that kind of couple of year experience and maybe just compare it to other places that you've worked?
Yeah, I think it was the biggest thing, as we were talking about up here a little bit, it's like this, the Ringer too, but is the freedom to do what you wanted to do. So many places I think would tell you that, how can you write the kind of story that my magazine puts out or that my website puts out, right? How can you fill the box in like I want you to? And then Grantland comes along, and it's how can you just write whatever? How can you be the best Bryan Curtis you want to be? How can you blaze your own trail, you know? And then you have Bill, who's sitting there, who happens to be the most popular sports writer on earth, right? Who's tweeting your stuff and supporting you, and being just really, really trying to. Who's really the guy who's behind that mission, right? Of you being the best you that you can be, and it was just terrific. I think that you want to say the downside of it, since everyone says how great it was. The downside of it was sometimes there's just too much freedom, and I would just be like, this is absolutely what I want to do, and they'd say that's fantastic, and then I go do it. I was like, why did I do that? Why didn't somebody tell me to go do something else? But it really was that great, and it really was a great fun time.
Hi, I'm Ian Thompson.
Hi, Ian.
Hey, I enjoyed your talk. I'm interested to know your views about mega sports, particularly the NFL, trying to shape the narrative that's coming out.
Yeah, you're talking about with injuries and all the other issues that the NFL is trying to shape right now?
No, it sort of links on to a bit about the concussion clearly, but certainly around the criticism of Goodell.
Yeah.
And the way he's taken the game, particularly around the Brady issue.
Mm-hmm. I think it's. I think if you looked at the coverage of the NFL right now in the United States, you'd probably find that it's mostly hostile. So whatever they just hired Joe. We were talking about sports and politics. They just hired Joe Lockhart as their spokesman, who was President Clinton's spokesman in the White House during some of the most turbulent years of the Clinton administration, right? And when you were hiring a political spokesman, you can see that you are trying to shape the narrative just like any other politician. I think it's probably correct to think of Roger Goodell as a politician more than anything else. But I don't think it's been very successful. And I don't really know, it's so funny because we have a couple of journalists in the United States who've been accused of carrying the NFL's water or writing the stories they wanted to write. And they've just been vilified. And I feel like the rest of the earth has come down like an anvil on top of Roger Goodell's head. So I don't think they've been very successful at shaping the narrative. And especially now with the wonderful reporting that's been done about concussions. Again, that's come from newspapers, from the New York Times, from Sports Illustrated, from a lot of people from ESPN. That's really held these guys to account. And now we have a lot more information. We have a Will Smith movie thanks to all this reporting, right? So I think they've certainly tried, and I would say that they've been very, very unsuccessful at getting us to write what they want us to write.
Hi, Bryan. How important is the incorporation of statistics into stories for you?
So, not for me personally that much, unless you and I can sit down and come up with the sabermetrics of sportscasting and sports writing, the kind of subjects I often write about. But to anybody who is entering the business right now and who is writing about actual sports a lot more than I do, I'd say it's essential. I'd say that understanding is absolutely one of the things you have to have. You do not need to be a sabermetrician or or an analytics guy yourself, though it doesn't hurt. But just having a familiarity with it and an ability to incorporate it. It's one of the biggest things about anybody who's older than me says. They just hate advanced stats with a couple of very noticeable exceptions. They fear them. They don't understand them. In baseball in the United States, we say, well, it's not like RBI's made all that much sense anyway. Like, who cares? You're just replacing one thing with another thing. But I think that's it. Now, we actually said this in the last talk, but I think there was an old world where we had two kinds of writers. We had the statistics guys, and then we had the guys who were kind of in the locker room, right? Those were two different worlds. And I think that now should be just one world, right? The guy who goes into the locker room after the footy game should have that stuff in his head. He should be able to talk to players about it, players who are willing to talk about it, right? And say, like, I've had some great experiences talking to people like Tom Haberstroh of ESPN, who would literally go up to Dwayne Wade and say, here's something I noticed about your shooting. You always, you go right 95% of the time when you get the ball here and you shoot right here on the court, literally pointing to a spot in the court. And why do you do that? And Dwayne Wade would say, well, here's why I do that, and would explain. And you have a great marriage of profile writing and analytics coming together as one. And to me, that's like the platonic ideal of sports writing right now. Like if somebody can do that, like Zach Lowe at ESPN or Tom or any number of guys in baseball, it's awesome. I love it.
Bryan, I just wanted to get your thoughts on when you haven't got a job, or when you're trying to break into the industry, like a lot of us are. How do you make sure that your opinion means more than someone just off the street? So if you're just writing for your blog, how do you get people to say, obviously if someone works for ESPN, it's different because they've got that ESPN title with them. But if they haven't got that, how do you make sure that your opinion on this game means more than someone else's?
I think it's pretty simple and just comes down to being really good, and I think obviously when you're starting out participating in the larger world of Twitter, is good because people find you, they know you, they like you, you're recommending other people's stories and they're looking at your stories and stuff like that. But I think what is it original that you're bringing to the table, right? Why do I absolutely have to read you after the game as opposed to the million other choices I have on ESPN or not? Maybe it's fancy writing, maybe it's analytics, maybe it's you're just really funny, and so I have to absolutely read your stuff. But I just think what is the thing that I'm bringing to this that's different and that I'm going to work on and get better at? So that's what I'd say.
I've heard before that it's important to be diverse in what you can write about and to know a lot about different fields. And you're a writer that's written across not just a number of sports, but also politics. So for you, how do you stay, in the loop enough to have that reserve of knowledge across different disciplines to write?
That's hard. I mean, I think that's the hardest thing for me because I don't like to do sports and politics and then feel like I'm paying a ton of attention to one and the other one I'm just showing up on game day or debate day, as it were. So I think one is just reading a lot of news, a lot of general news. I try to read, I get the actual paper, New York Times at home. Try to read as much of that every day as I can. So I'm not just reading sports news. I have all kinds of ideas. I'm reading about what's going on in Africa and what's going on in the Middle East and that kind of stuff. And at least never been an expert on those subjects, but at least have a good working knowledge of that. This is another thing, by the way, in terms of being a sports writer right now, I think we should also say is that it used to be when you were a sports writer, you were a sports writer. Mm-hmm. Maybe you were just a hockey writer, heaven forbid. Or maybe you were just a footy writer. Or maybe you were just this. And that was a really narrow thing to be, right? And if you went to your editor and said, gee, I'd like to write about the presidential election, they'd be like, are you out of your mind? Go back to the game, idiot. But now, we live in a world, thanks to Twitter and the web and the way we think about things, you can actually write about a lot of different kinds of things. You can be a well-rounded human being, not just at home, but in print.
And sometimes within the same piece, too, and those things can inform your writing as well.
Absolutely.
So that, and there's less of a stigma now, I suppose, about weaving that outside knowledge into your sports writing, whereas in the past, we would have perhaps tended to... make fun of people who weave those things into sports writing. Yeah,
or it just wouldn't have been seen as appropriate. But everybody on earth is thinking about Donald Trump. So why wouldn't Donald Trump, it doesn't have to be in every piece, but if it works, why wouldn't the specter of Donald Trump, if it's on your mind, why wouldn't it be on your piece or in your piece, right?
Thanks, Bryan, for the talk. We're talking about long form, in the context of 3,000 or 4,000 word articles. How do you see the future for non-fiction books?
It's a good question. I think if you had asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have put an expiration label on books. I would not have expected the book industry to be what it is now, which is still, to me, fairly unchanged from what it was 10 years ago. Still being a voracious appetite for nonfiction books. At least, I don't know the Australian book market that well, but at least in terms of the United States, there's still being a really great market for books of all kinds of nonfiction. Publishers still snapping them up. Writers still getting very nice contracts to write them. All subjects. It's not just, I probably, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I'd probably said the book market would have dried up a lot. We'd be reading in ebook form almost totally. and you would probably be down to a few famous guys like Bill Bryson and people who were brand names just churning out books. That's not actually what happened at all. So I feel pretty, and maybe we're in a bubble. Maybe the bottom's going to fall out tomorrow, but I feel it's pretty great right now, or at least really good, considering the way the world's changed. And I think ebooks have been really helpful in that regard. Isn't it wonderful that you can buy a book in 2 seconds? I mean, that's just like again, it's like an old guy, but that's just like isn't that wonderful? I mean, I just find that to be the greatest thing on earth, that you can just go buy. It used to be so hard to find stuff. So I'm pretty optimistic about that.
Hey guys, I've got a question for all the guys on the panel. If you don't have a lot of contacts in the industry and you're looking to track down someone to interview, how do you go about that? Where would you start if you're trying to track down an interview subject?
Give us an example. Who are we talking about here?
I don't know. So say I'm looking to interview an AFL footballer. How do I go about, getting in contact with them, maybe getting a phone number so I can arrange an interview or something like that?
Well, I guess in the case of an AFL footballer, all of that's run through the media departments now. I think probably a better example to use would be someone from left field a bit, and maybe set yourself the task of getting an interviewee who is maybe a little easier to get to, because those players are fairly tightly controlled now. There is a limit to how many media commitments they're expected to fulfil per week. Merryn's actually probably better to answer this one because it's her area of expertise as far as the way club media departments work, but some are also better than others. So there are clubs who are more open in their access to players than others, but I'm not sure. What would your tip be, Merryn?
Well, I think probably, as I've told a lot of you guys before, is that the AFL players are so covered everywhere, and I actually think there's a lot of other great sports stories out there that haven't been told. And why wouldn't you, as students, go and actually tell those stories first, rather than trying to get access to an AFL player who has had their story told in media before? And it's also going to be harder for you to actually, if you want to go and interview Buddy Franklin, I mean, it's a great story, but can you convince me that you can tell that story better than, say, Greg Baum or Emma Quayle or someone else? Like, it's a harder sell. Whereas I think there are so many great stories out there in sport that you can get really good access to that can actually be told. And so I think it's more it depends where you are in the scale of things in journalism as well. So if you work in a newspaper, you might be able to get access to do that, but I think it's looking for sources that tell the best stories for where you're placed.
And one bit of advice I would give as far as starting out is to maybe approach it this way. Write a story about a past player who had something interesting happen to them. Because what you'll find, and this is how I started out myself, so one of my early stories I wrote about a Queensland Sheffield Shield cricketer from the 1990s who'd been called for throwing in a game, and that this event marked his career. Now, he's not in high demand as an interviewee. He was shocked when I called. I got his number through the Queensland Cricket Association. They were baffled that I wanted to talk to him because it was so long ago. But then people read that story and they think, oh, this guy's story is interesting and I didn't know it. So then you might do another one and it gathers a momentum that all of a sudden maybe you became known as someone who finds these oddball stories, and that can be a stepping stone to the bigger names. But I would also say, as a general rule, that sometimes the bigger names aren't the most interesting people too. So, you have to be realistic with that access. But I think the stepping stone to getting that can sometimes be looking at the fringes.
I have a quick question that I'd actually like to ask both of you, because I guess one of the interesting things to me is that we oftentimes, and I think about it too when I'm teaching these guys, is we think sports reporting is going to press conferences, reporting on games. But both of you actually do so much really great, interesting writing that isn't really about that isn't about having access or reporting on games. Do you think there's opportunities to do more of that now?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a terrific example. You just think about when you go to games, there's just 100 people there, and the media access is very small. And games are awesome. I have nothing against that at all. But what are you going to get? really that's so interesting there, especially since match reports or gamers or are just really not much of a form in sports writing anymore, or not that interesting anymore. I find, to your point about when you call people that aren't very famous, they always have two reactions. They say, "What do you want to talk to me for?" Which is like what you're talking about. Or they say, "Gee, I've been waiting for someone to call," because they just imagine that they're this important world historical figure that everyone just never called, and you call. Thank goodness, finally, I've been waiting years for somebody to tell my story.
And what's undervalued in that regard too, I think, is approaching people who are older, right? Who have had a life experience and they've had a long time to think about it and contextualize it. And sometimes a horrific event in their past, a sporting mishap or whatever it is, that can either be amplified and they have a really interesting take on it because it's gnawed at them, but also sometimes they can be quite philosophical and they've thought about it a lot. So you get not only the story about that one thing that happened to them, but you get the story of how it affected their life afterwards. So one thing I try and do a lot is speak to older sports people and talk to them about those experiences, because the other thing with older sports people is they usually played in an era where things were less professional. The behavioural standards perhaps weren't what they are now, and they often have funnier and more interesting stories than current players do in their kind of tightly controlled environment, hyper-professional environments that they operate in.
Hey, my name's Alex. You write about both sports and politics for a very rare publication that covers both, and one of the most compelling, exciting kind of stories that covers both is Colin Kaepernick and that whole issue. I think it's fair to observe that The Ringer has made an editorial decision not to cover it in an overwhelmingly supportive way, or to cover much of it, which is interesting for a kind of more marginal media outlet and the positioning of The Ringer and kind of what it does. I was wondering if you could take us behind the scenes of the editorial decision making around that, and if people have tried to write from different angles about that, and just kind of further advice about covering politics in sports.
You mean supportive of Colin Kaepernick when you say supportive?
Yeah.
I don't detect that from us. I mean, I don't know if we've been doing the, literally been covering every. I literally haven't read The Ringer since he talked after the game on Sunday night, so I don't know what we did or didn't do about that. But I think when it first happened, I know because I wrote the first piece we had about it, which was comparing him to John Carlos and Tommy Smythe from the '68 Olympics, and comparing Donald Trump to Richard Nixon. So I think, and if I didn't explicitly say it, then I much more support the former rather than the latter. So I don't know that. And then we did a podcast, I know, where we interviewed the guy who broke the news. I think Bill on his show talked a lot about athletes and protests and got into it with other athletes who were talking about Kaepernick. So I don't know that we made an editorial decision at all about him, and if we did, it certainly wasn't not to be supportive of him. Maybe we should write more about him. I think it's just the most fascinating story to me, and I think I have this theory that sports writers have gotten more liberal in the United States over the last 10 years or so. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. One of them is because the athletes have led the way. In a way, the athletes have gotten out there and engaged in protest and political activism, and they've given cover to the writers who might have been scared to go out on that limb. Not just with Kaepernick, but LeBron James, right? Michael Jordan in his somewhat milquetoast statement the other day, but at least it was different than the old 90s Jordan, right? And that's been one of the most amazing changes to me, and it's had this boomerang effect on the writers, because now I look at all my writers and my fellow writers like, whoa, look, this is like we sound like we're at a protest in the 60s in a good way. We're actually talking about issues, engaging with the world, not just writing about, so-and-so won the game stuff.
Just before I ask my question, Bryan, I'd just like to say, Russell, just to your point about writing articles on former sports stars, I loved your Vinny Catoggio story. It was a great one.
Yeah, well, that's a great example of that, where he's this guy, so he played in a VFL Grand Final when he was 18 years old, was third game of league football, and he was thrown to the Wolves, had a bad game, and became a scapegoat for that game, right? Well, he plays another 8 years of league football, but that moment and how he felt in the aftermath of that game marks his entire life. He's 62 years old now, and he said to me, you know, it's only in the last 10 years that I've come to appreciate that it wasn't the worst thing in the world, and that people do love me for the way I played football. And it's this really amazing thing, right, that even if I interviewed him when he was 30, he wouldn't have had that perspective on his life to say, you know, he probably still would have thought, you know, oh, that was, you know, wasn't good, that game, you know, it still haunts me. But he's now moved past it. And to me, that's a more interesting story than what happened last week in the footy sometimes. Sometimes not, but in his instance, he just thought about it a lot, and he had a lot to say about it.
Thanks, Bryan. I'm interested in the behaviour of your audience for The Ringer, and why you have the confidence to tell readers how long the article is going to take to read.
That's a Medium thing, you know, which is who was our host and who designed the website for us. I think it's kind of handy in a way in this new world when you don't, especially when our layout, you know, we don't have like, this is a blog post, this is a feature, that when you click on it, you have some idea of what you're about to read. Because I know on the web sometimes, not on The Ringer, but on other places, I get excited because I get a couple paragraphs in, I kind of, you know, get comfortable. It's like I'm on the Qantas flight from LA to Melbourne, you know, settling in for a nice long one. And then the story just ends, and I go, wait a second, there was like 3 paragraphs. It's over? So I think there is a little bit of a nice truth in advertising thing. And it also just is probably a practical thing, right? Sometimes people are reading, you know, during lunch, or they're reading on their phone as they're, you know, walking down the street, and you want to give them a little bit of a heads up, especially when it's going to be a giant transatlantic or trans-Pacific flight of a story, that this is going to take some time, and you may want to sit down and print it out or whatever you have to do to get through it.
And also that idea, we're talking the other day about you can't get too wrapped up in people reading every word of your story sometimes, because if you do a 6,500 word monster essay, that might take 25 minutes to read. And at The Guardian, we've got metrics that tell us how long people have spent on the page on average. And it can sometimes be ego-crushing to see that that's 90 seconds, you know, and you look at it tells you how long the thing takes to read, and then it tells you how long people have actually spent reading it. And a classic example of that, we had Rob Smythe, a UK sports writer. He wrote this piece about the 1992 Liverpool Spice Boys team. It was a 20,000 word essay that took 46 minutes or something like that to read. There were 60,000 reads on the first day, which is great. And then you look down at that measurement, and it was 1 minute and 12 second average that people had spent. And so often within 5 minutes of those stories going up, 100 people have tweeted them, check out this great story, you know, and they haven't read it. So
that used to happen to us at Grantland 30 seconds after. A masterpiece, you know, wait a second, you didn't read that. Wait a second.
Yeah.
I do like your point too about older athletes, because I think this, when you talk about Colin Kaepernick's a fascinating story right now. Colin Kaepernick's also going to be a fascinating story when he's 35 and 45 and 55, when the next generation of activist athletes comes around, right? And I think that's a great lesson for young people too. It's just, you just catch people, you know, journalism is about catching somebody in a moment in time, right? And different moments in time in their lives are fascinating. And some people who are really famous, we just go back to again and again and again and again and again. I mean, Jim Brown or something, you know, they've just been literally fascinating for their entire lives.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in there too? It's a really interesting point before we wind up, because I think that one thing that's lost is that people without a sense of history or knowledge of what went before them don't know how to contextualise past events and put them in a current context. So, for instance, if you wanted to do an example of somebody who failed a drug test in the 80s, Alex Watson failed a drug test in the 80s as a pentathlete, I think he was, a decathlete, in 1988 at the...
Caffeine kid.
For having too much caffeine in his system. So imagine going to him now and talking to him as he watches the world TUEs.
I got an email from him.
Did you?
Recently. Yeah.
I reckon he'd be a fascinating story, and you could tell his story through the lens of what's happening with drug testing and sort of almost industrialised drug cheating in the 21st century relative to what he did, which was take caffeine pills, which in the AFL, for instance, has been legal for a long time. So something that's now been legalised in the game cost him his reputation as an Olympian. It's extraordinary.
Hey, he wants to talk about it. I didn't send him the email. He sent it to me. So
see, there you go.
Yeah, and you get these... And what Bryan said is important too about getting people at a time in their life, that sometimes we define people by what they did in their sporting career rather than treating them as the interesting human being that they often are since then. And that's something always to keep in mind, I guess, when you profile people, is that you're not sort of talking to their former self, that you're talking to the person they are now.
And I sort of gate crashed the conversation.
No, but I think the other interesting thing we say is that literally every story has happened before. This is the other thing you realize as a journalist. There is nothing. You are telling a new thing, you know. That Tim Cahill goal we saw the other night was a new goal. It was literally not, we're not in a time machine of some sort. But when you read books and stuff like that, you realize everything has happened, right? There have been, drug testing has been going on forever. You know, these kind of controversies have been going on forever. Colin Kaepernick, there were predecessors to him and predecessors to them and predecessors to them. And, you know, when you read books and things like that, you find wonderful ideas for stories. Because everything kind of comes, the wheel turns and everything comes around again and everything is newly relevant.
And the challenge will be to find what makes it different now and why are our values different now to what they were when Alex Watson tested positive. And that is in there, tells you something about, through his experience, what we're experiencing now. Anyway.
Absolutely.
I think that's about it because we're running down the clock, but I just wanted to say thank you to our panel. Bryan has been superb over 2 sessions here. We've learnt so much from his visit, and we can't thank him enough for coming all this way and sharing his knowledge and being so giving. Give him a big round of applause, Bryan Curtis. Thank you very much. And Merryn Sherwood as well from the Trobe University. And Russell Jackson as well. It's just been fantastic over a couple of sessions. Can I also say thank you for coming out on a wet Tuesday. If you want to go out and grab something to eat and then come back just before 8, you're more than welcome on a free pass to hang around and catch Tim with me on the stage as well, because we really do appreciate you being here today. And we'll be back here about 7:45, I reckon. And, Michael will just stamp your ticket twice. You get double the value for coming along. Thanks for being part of the Sports Writers Festival, and maybe see you a little later on.